The rain poured heavily, creating a rhythmic tapping sound against the windows of the luxurious Hawthorne mansion. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Edward Hawthorne, a wealthy businessman, stormed through the grand hallway, his face contorted in frustration. His twin sons, Ethan and Eli, had been nothing short of a nightmare for every nanny they had hired. No one could handle them, not even the most experienced caregivers. They were known for their wild tantrums, unpredictable behavior, and refusal to listen to authority. Despite their father's best efforts, the twins had grown more unruly with each passing year. They were the kind of children who made every adult around them question their ability to raise them properly. As Edward paced back and forth, his thoughts drifted to the latest nanny he had hired. She lasted barely a week before breaking down in tears and quitting, claiming the boys were too much for her. Edward slammed his fist against the wall, his mind racing for a solution. Then, just as he was about to give up hope, his assistant mentioned something that caught his attention. "Sir," she said, "there's a new maid starting today. She comes highly recommended, though she's only been with us for a few days." Edward raised an eyebrow. He wasn't sure what to expect from someone so low on the household staff hierarchy. But at this point, he was willing to try anything. He nodded curtly, signaling for the maid to be brought in. Maya Williams, a quiet young woman in her mid-20s, entered the room with a tray of freshly brewed coffee. She was slender, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, and her eyes revealed a depth of thought that was unusual for someone in her position. She was different from the other staff members, who typically avoided eye contact with their employer. Maya didn't shrink under Edward's gaze. Instead, she met his eyes directly, offering a polite smile. As she placed the coffee on the table in front of him, he couldn't help but wonder what made her different. "I hear you've been working with the twins," Edward said, his voice laced with skepticism. Maya nodded, her expression calm. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I've been asked to look after them for the day." Edward couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. How could someone like her, a maid with no formal training, possibly control his unruly children? But something about Maya's demeanor intrigued him. She didn't seem nervous or intimidated like the others. Instead, she exuded a quiet confidence, the kind of confidence that made Edward wonder if she might be able to handle the twins where others had failed. "Good luck," he muttered under his breath, unsure if he truly believed in her ability to succeed. As the day went on, Maya proved to be unlike any of the previous nannies or caretakers. She handled the boys with a gentle firmness, never raising her voice, but always making her presence felt. Ethan and Eli, usually so defiant, found themselves listening to her in ways they never did with anyone else. It was as though she spoke their language, one they didn't even know they understood. Maya's ability to calm them, to connect with them, was nothing short of miraculous. By the end of the day, the twins were calmer, more cooperative than they had ever been. Edward, watching from a distance, couldn't believe his eyes. Could this quiet maid truly be the one to tame his wild sons? He found himself intrigued, but at the same time, he felt a sense of unease. Could she really do the impossible? Could a mere maid actually break through the walls of resistance his sons had built over the years? Introduction of the good-hearted character, Maya Williams. A few days had passed since Maya started working at the Hawthorne mansion, and each day had been more surprising than the last. Unlike the other staff, she was not easily overwhelmed by the twins' antics. While the other nannies had taken to avoiding the boys' tantrums, Maya quietly stood her ground. Her gentle approach and patient demeanor made it clear to the boys that she was not someone to be intimidated. Ethan and Eli had grown up in a world of luxury, but their behavior had been anything but refined. They were used to getting their way, and the household staff had always been too afraid to stand up to them. Maya, on the other hand, didn't seem to care about the power dynamics. She didn't care that they were the children of a billionaire. She simply treated them as children, with respect and kindness, but also with a firm hand when necessary. Her approach was different. Maya didn't lecture the boys or yell at them, as the others had. She didn't punish them for their misbehavior. Instead, she found ways to connect with them, to help them understand the value of kindness and consideration. She made them laugh when they were angry, and she calmed their fears when they were scared. It was subtle, but effective. Maya knew that what the boys needed most was not discipline, but understanding. She had learned this from her own life, growing up in difficult circumstances, where she had to look out for her younger brother and show him the love and care he needed. That had made her resilient and empathetic, qualities that she believed were more important than anything else. Maya didn't expect immediate results, but after a few days, she began to see the changes. The twins, who had once been defiant and disruptive, started to open up to her. They began to listen, to follow instructions, and to even smile at her. Their behavior had not changed overnight, but Maya could sense a shift. She could feel that the walls around their hearts were slowly crumbling. Edward, too, had noticed. He observed from a distance, but he couldn't deny the difference in his son's behavior. For the first time in years, the twins were calmer, more respectful, and more willing to listen. Edward had tried everything before: hiring the best nannies, attending parenting seminars, seeking professional help, but nothing had worked. And yet, here was Maya, a humble maid, doing what no one else had been able to do. It both impressed and confused him. He couldn't understand how a woman with no formal training in child development could have such an effect on his children. But as he watched her interact with Ethan and Eli, something in his heart shifted. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. Maybe it wasn't about wealth, status, or formal qualifications. Maybe it was about kindness and patience. But Edward was still skeptical. He couldn't quite let go of the belief that the boys needed more than what Maya was offering. They needed discipline, structure, and consequences for their actions. But as the days went on, he found himself doubting his own instincts. Maya's approach seemed to be working, even if he couldn't fully explain why. He began to see the glimmer of hope he hadn't seen in years. Maybe this was the turning point he had been waiting for. Maya's quiet strength had begun to show its true impact on the Hawthorne twins. Day by day, she worked her magic with subtle care. Ethan, who had once been nearly impossible to control, was now willing to sit quietly during their sessions together. Eli, the more difficult of the two, started to respond to Maya's calm voice instead of throwing tantrums. Even the smallest progress felt like a victory. Edward Hawthorne couldn't deny that something was changing, but the doubt still lingered. Could this really be the solution? Was it really just Maya's gentle touch and patience that were transforming his children, or was there something deeper at play? He observed from a distance, watching as Maya handled the twins with a grace and understanding that left him both intrigued and baffled. It had only been a few days, yet the difference was undeniable. The twins were no longer throwing their usual fits. Instead, they were laughing, playing, and even following Maya's guidance. The household was quieter, more peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once reigned. Edward had to admit it was strange, but it felt like magic. Maya wasn't just managing the boys. She was reaching them in a way no one had before. One afternoon, Maya found herself sitting in the grand living room with the twins. They were drawing, a rare moment of calm, and Maya sat with them, watching them carefully as they worked. Ethan looked up at her and smiled shyly. "Maya," he said, his voice soft, "you're different from the other people we've had here." Maya smiled back, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "How so?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for a moment before responding. "You don't yell. You don't make us do things we don't want to do. You just help us." Eli, who had been quietly sketching, suddenly looked up. "Yeah, and you listen when we talk. Like when we say we don't want to go to bed, you don't just tell us to shut up." Maya's heart swelled with warmth at their words. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that they were starting to see her as more than just a maid. They were starting to trust her. "I listen because you both matter," Maya replied, her voice soft but firm. "And when you feel like you matter, you start to listen. Too." The twins exchanged a glance, and for a brief moment, Maya saw the walls around their hearts crumble a little more. They didn't know it yet, but they were beginning to understand. Maya had no illusions. She knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult. The twins were not going to change overnight. But for the first time, Maya felt hope for them. Hope that they could be different. That they could be better. Later that evening, as Maya was tidying up in the kitchen, Edward approached her. His steps were slow, measured, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Maya," he began, "I've been watching you with the boys." Maya turned to face him, her expression neutral but open. "I can see the difference," Edward continued. "You've done something that no one else has been able to do. The twins, they're calmer, more obedient. It's impressive." Maya didn't say anything right away. She simply nodded, acknowledging the compliment without making it into something bigger than it was. "They're good boys," Maya said quietly. "They just need someone who believes in them." Edward paused for a moment, considering her words. "I don't know what you're doing, but it's working," he said finally. "I can't thank you enough." Maya smiled softly, but there was no smugness in it, no sense of pride. She had simply done what she felt was right. It was her purpose to care, to help, to heal. That was enough for her. But as Edward looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, he realized something. The person who had made the difference in his children's lives was not the best nanny money could buy. It wasn't some expert in child development. It was Maya, a simple maid with nothing but her heart and a quiet strength. Edward's mind was spinning. How had this happened? How had Maya, someone so unassuming, managed to break through the resistance his sons had built over the years? It didn't make sense. But as he looked at his sons, now calmly playing in the next room, he couldn't ignore the truth. Maya had done the impossible. She had reached them in a way no one else could. And that realization sent a ripple of doubt through Edward's mind. Maybe he had been wrong all along. Maybe he had been wrong about everything. It was early one morning when Maya first noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Edward had been watching the twins, observing how they had been behaving differently around her. They were no longer the uncontrollable, demanding children who disrupted everything in their path. They were quieter, kinder, more respectful. Ethan, the more headstrong twin, had even started following her directions without argument. Eli, the more withdrawn of the two, was now sitting down to breakfast without making a scene. It was small, but significant progress. Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. She had spent her whole life caring for others, learning how to be patient and understanding, how to help others heal. Now, it seemed, the twins were starting to heal, too. But as the days went by, Maya began to notice something else, something more unsettling. Edward, despite his quiet gratitude, was beginning to keep his distance. He wasn't harsh with her, but there was an invisible wall between them now. It wasn't the warmth she had felt when he had first acknowledged her work with the twins. Instead, it was a kind of apprehension, a hesitation that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Maya tried not to dwell on it. She had a job to do, and the twins still needed her. But there were moments when she caught him watching her from afar, his expression unreadable, and she couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. One afternoon, as she was sitting with Ethan and Eli in the living room, helping them with their homework, Edward walked in. He paused at the doorway, watching them for a moment before stepping inside. "Maya," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She set down the pencil she had been holding and looked up at him, trying to read his face. "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne," she replied. "What's on your mind?" Edward hesitated before answering. "It's about the way you've been working with the boys." Maya nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. "I've been trying my best to help them," she said, her voice steady. "I know," Edward replied. "I can see that. But there's something I'm not sure about." He walked over to the sofa, sitting down across from her. The twins, sensing the tension in the air, fell silent. Maya waited for him to continue. "I've noticed a change in the boys," Edward began. "They're more obedient, more calm. And I don't know if it's because of you or if they've just grown out of their behavior." Maya wasn't sure how to respond. She had always believed in the power of understanding and patience, but hearing Edward question it left her feeling vulnerable. "I think it's because of what you've done," Edward added, his tone softer now. But I don't know what to make of it. You've managed to break through to them in a way I didn't think was possible. And now, I'm not sure what the right thing is to do. Maya looked at him for a long moment, taking in the conflict in his eyes. She could see that he was struggling with his own beliefs, trying to reconcile the results he was seeing with his own assumptions about how things should be. Edward, Maya said gently, using his first name for the first time, I understand that this is hard to understand. But the boys are good kids. They just needed someone to show them that they could be better. That they didn't have to be trapped by their own fears or frustrations. Edward looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But how do I know it's not just temporary? He asked. How do I know that this isn't just a phase, that the boys won't go back to their old ways once you're not around? Maya's heart ached. She knew that doubt was a natural part of the process, but it still hurt to hear him question the work she had put in. I don't have all the answers, she said softly. But I believe in them. I believe that, with time, they can change. But they need consistency. They need to know that someone is there for them, not just when it's convenient, but always. Edward's gaze softened. For the first time in days, he seemed to let go of the tension he had been holding in his shoulders. I don't know if I'm ready to let go of the old way of doing things, he admitted. But I can see that you're doing something right. And that's something I can't ignore. Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. The wall between them was starting to crumble, just as the walls around the boys' hearts had. Edward wasn't fully on board yet, but he was beginning to understand. Thank you for believing in them, he said quietly. Maya smiled, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. It's what they need, she replied. And I'm here for them, for as long as they need me. The days passed, and the atmosphere in the Hawthorne mansion had transformed. Edward watched, still uncertain but increasingly impressed, as Maya's influence on the twins grew stronger. The boys, once impossible to control, were now acting more like the children Edward had always hoped they would be. They were more respectful, calmer, and, most importantly, they were starting to listen. Maya's method of understanding and patience was working. Still, Edward couldn't fully let go of his skepticism. He wasn't ready to believe that it was all because of Maya, the maid. But as he saw his sons growing into better versions of themselves, he couldn't deny the change. One afternoon, as Maya sat with the boys in the garden, Edward found himself standing at the window, watching them from a distance. Maya was talking to them, her voice soft yet firm. Ethan was sitting cross-legged, listening intently, while Eli, who had always been the more difficult of the two, seemed to be genuinely engaged in the conversation. Edward's heart swelled with a mix of pride and confusion. Could this really be the same woman who had come into his home just weeks ago? He had hired her for cleaning, never expecting her to become the turning point in his children's lives. As the days went on, Edward continued to see the subtle but significant changes in the twins. They were still energetic, still full of life, but they had learned to channel their energy in positive ways. They no longer threw tantrums over small things, and their once volatile moods had stabilized. The house felt different now, peaceful, almost. It was a far cry from the chaotic environment it had been when he first hired Maya. It wasn't just the twins who had changed, either. Edward had noticed something in himself as well. He had become more patient, more understanding, less quick to dismiss the efforts of those around him. Maya had made him realize that he had been too focused on the wrong things, on wealth, status, and control, and not enough on what really mattered, the well-being of his family. One evening, after dinner, Edward found himself sitting in the living room, waiting for Maya to finish cleaning up. He had wanted to talk to her, to ask her about her past, to understand what had made her so capable of doing what no one else could. When she entered the room, he gestured for her to sit. Maya, he began, his voice gentle, I've been meaning to talk to you about everything that's happened with the boys. Maya looked at him, her expression calm but curious. Of course, Mr. Hawthorne, she replied, sitting down across from him. Edward hesitated, unsure of how to ask the questions that had been weighing on him. I don't understand how you do it, he said finally. How do you get them to listen? How do you reach them when no one else could? Maya was silent for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. She looked down at her hands before meeting his gaze again. "It's not about control, Edward," she said softly. "It's about understanding. Kids, they need to know that they're not alone. That they're not just being told what to do, but that someone is there, seeing them for who they really are." Edward looked at her, his brow furrowing. "But they're not easy, Maya. They've always been this way. I didn't think they could change." Maya smiled gently. "They've always had the potential to change. You just had to show them the way. And you did, in your own way. But they needed someone to guide them who wouldn't give up." Edward sat back, processing her words. He had never considered it that way. For so long, he had believed that money, status, and authority were the things that would make his children turn out well. He hadn't realized that what they needed most was someone who cared, someone who would show them the value of kindness, empathy, and respect. "I think I've been wrong," Edward said quietly, more to himself than to Maya. "I've been focused on all the wrong things." Maya didn't respond immediately, but her eyes softened with understanding. She had known that the path to helping Edward see the truth would be a long one, but it was happening. Slowly, but surely, he was beginning to understand. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it was a moment of quiet connection. After a few moments, Edward spoke again, his voice firmer this time. "Maya, I'm grateful for everything you've done. I don't know what we would have done without you." Maya smiled, her eyes meeting his. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Hawthorne," she said softly. But Edward knew, deep down, that it was more than that. Maya had done more than just her job. She had changed the lives of his children and, in turn, had begun to change him as well. The days continued to pass, and Maya's presence in the Hawthorne mansion became more than just a job. It was becoming a turning point for the entire family. Ethan and Eli, once wild and unruly, were now starting to show a more tender side of themselves. They still had their moments of mischief, but the tantrums, the outbursts, and the chaos had significantly diminished. They listened when Maya spoke, they followed her guidance, and for the first time in years, the household felt like a home instead of a battleground. Edward watched all of this with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was grateful for the transformation in his sons. On the other hand, he was still struggling to reconcile his past beliefs about authority and control with the softer, more nurturing approach that Maya had introduced. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Edward found himself watching his sons interact with Maya. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the floor, his head tilted in curiosity as Maya spoke to him softly. Eli, who had always been the quieter one, was leaning against the couch, silently listening. The room was calm, peaceful, something that had once seemed impossible. Maya's ability to create this atmosphere of peace was something Edward couldn't ignore. Still, he had a lingering sense of doubt. Could this really last? Was it possible that Maya's influence on the boys would remain, or would they eventually slip back into their old ways? He needed to know. As if sensing his thoughts, Maya looked up from where she was sitting with the twins. She met his gaze across the room, her eyes calm and understanding, as though she knew exactly what he was thinking. Edward didn't know how she did it, but it seemed like she could always read him, like she could see into his soul. After a moment of silent exchange, Edward stood up and walked over to where Maya was sitting. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, watching the way she interacted with his children. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for her. Maya had been so much more than just a maid. She had become a guiding force in their lives, a silent healer in a family that had been broken by years of neglect and misunderstandings. Finally, Edward spoke. "Maya," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking about everything that's changed since you arrived here." Maya looked up at him, her expression neutral but gentle. She didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. "I don't understand how you do it," Edward confessed, his voice tinged with both awe and confusion. "How do you get them to listen? How do you make them trust you when they've never trusted anyone else?" Maya paused before responding. She looked down at the twins for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "It's not magic," she said softly. It's just understanding. I listen to them. I see them for who they really are, not just for their behavior or what others think of them. Everyone else saw them as a problem. I see them as children who need someone to show them a better way. Edward's heart tightened as he absorbed her words. It was simple, yet profound. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, thinking that he could force the world to bend to his will. But Maya had shown him that real change didn't come from power. It came from empathy. It came from love. I've been wrong, Edward said quietly, more to himself than to Maya. I thought that being strong, being in control, would fix everything. But maybe I've been missing the most important thing. Maya looked at him, her gaze steady and kind. It's never too late to change, Edward, she said softly. The boys just needed to see that they mattered. They needed to know that someone was there for them, not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be. Edward nodded slowly, taking in her words. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He had been so focused on achieving success, on controlling every aspect of his life, that he had forgotten what truly mattered: connection, understanding, and the willingness to change. He looked at Maya, a sense of deep gratitude washing over him. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for showing me what's really important. Maya gave him a small, sincere smile. I'm just doing what I believe is right, she replied softly. You've always had the answers, Edward. You just needed someone to help you see them. Edward stood there for a moment, lost in his thoughts. The world seemed to shift around him as he processed everything that had happened. He realized that Maya had done more than help his children. She had helped him, too. She had opened his eyes to a world of possibilities he had never considered. A world where kindness, patience, and understanding were the true keys to success. The road ahead would still be difficult. The changes Maya had brought about in the boys were only the beginning. But Edward now knew that he didn't have to do it alone. With Maya's guidance, the family was on the path to healing. And for the first time in years, he felt hopeful about the future. The days turned into weeks, and Maya's influence on the Hawthorne twins only grew stronger. The boys were changing in ways Edward hadn't thought possible. They were learning, growing, and starting to become the young men he had always hoped for. Their bond with Maya had become something more than just caretaker and children. It was a deep, unspoken connection that seemed to transcend their differences. Ethan, once defiant and full of energy, was now showing moments of reflection and care. He would help his brother, Eli, with small tasks, something he would never have done before. Eli, the quieter twin, was opening up more, smiling more, and even taking the initiative to speak his mind. Edward had watched these changes with awe, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had spent his life building his empire, focusing on wealth and status, believing that those things were what truly mattered. But now, seeing his children thrive under Maya's gentle guidance, he realized that he had been wrong. He had been so focused on providing for them in material ways that he had neglected the emotional needs they had, the needs for love, understanding, and connection. One afternoon, after a quiet lunch, Edward called Maya into his office. It was the first time he had asked her to join him outside of their usual interactions. Maya had become more than just a maid in his eyes, she had become an integral part of his family's healing. She entered the office, her usual calm demeanor in place, but there was a slight hesitation in her step as she approached. Edward stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling estate, his mind working through the words he had been holding back for so long. Maya, he began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of uncertainty, I need to ask you something. About the boys. Maya stood quietly, waiting for him to continue. They've changed, Edward said, turning to face her. They've grown so much since you've been here. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like something is different. Maya nodded, her expression soft. They've always had the potential, Edward, she said, her voice calm but full of understanding. It just took someone to help them see it. To help them feel that they're worth believing in. Edward looked at her, his gaze searching. I've been thinking about what you said before, about what they need, he said quietly. And I think you're right. I've been so focused on the wrong things. I wanted to fix them, to control them, but I never thought about the emotional side, about what they really need from me. Maya's eyes softened as she stepped closer, her presence calming him. It's never too late to change, Edward, she said gently. They just needed to know that they matter. And that's what you've given them. Edward swallowed hard, his heart tightening with emotion. He had never thought of it that way. His mind had always been consumed with making sure the boys had everything they could ever want, but now he understood that what they needed most was something far more simple: love, patience, and belief. I'm afraid it might be too late for me, Edward admitted, his voice low. I've missed so much. I've been too distant, too focused on the wrong things. Can I really make up for all that time? Maya shook her head gently. You're here now, she said softly. That's what matters. The past is gone, Edward. All you can do is move forward and be there for them. Just as you're doing now. Edward felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. He had been so afraid of failure, of not being the perfect father, that he had forgotten what it meant to simply show up, to be present. The twins had been through so much, and now he realized that it wasn't too late for him to make a difference in their lives. He could still be the father they needed. Thank you, Edward whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for showing me what really matters. I don't know where I'd be without you. Maya smiled, a soft, knowing smile. I'm just doing what I can, Edward. You've always had the strength to change. You just needed to believe in yourself. Edward's heart swelled with gratitude, and in that moment, he knew that he had made the right choice in bringing Maya into their lives. She had done more than care for his children. She had opened his eyes to a new way of living, a way where love, understanding, and patience were the true keys to success. And with that realization, Edward knew that he could finally be the father his children deserved. The road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, Edward felt hopeful. He knew that with Maya by his side, the family could overcome anything. The silence in the Hawthorne mansion had become a comfortable one. Edward, Maya, and the twins had reached a new understanding, and it was something that neither Edward nor Maya had anticipated but both had longed for. The boys were thriving, showing more care and empathy than they had before, and Edward had begun to change as well. He was no longer the rigid, controlling father he once was, but someone more present, more in tune with his children's emotional needs. He had learned that being a father wasn't about being perfect, but about being there, truly being there, for his children. But the journey wasn't without its doubts, and one evening, those doubts came crashing down. It was a typical Friday night. Maya was sitting with the twins in the living room, helping them with their schoolwork, while Edward was in his office. He had started working late again, something he hadn't done in a while. The rhythm of the house was familiar, comfortable, but Edward couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe this peace, this fragile harmony, wouldn't last. That evening, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, Edward's mind wandered back to the old ways. The pressure to perform, the constant drive for success, the idea that his worth was measured by his achievements, these were things he hadn't fully let go of. He had made significant progress, but there were moments when he couldn't help but wonder if he was doing enough. Had Maya's influence on the boys really been enough? Had he done enough to change their lives, to fix the mistakes of the past? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He opened it to find Maya standing there, her expression gentle but knowing. She had come to check on him, to see if he was okay. There was no agenda, no need for words, just the silent understanding that had developed between them over the weeks. Can we talk? Maya asked quietly, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. Edward stepped aside, allowing her in. He couldn't remember the last time they had a conversation, just the two of them. Over the past few weeks, everything had revolved around the boys, around the changes they had seen in them, but now, in the quiet of the night, Edward realized that there was more to their journey than just helping his sons. Maya sat down across from him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of everything they had been through. Finally, Edward broke the silence. I've been thinking, he started, his voice low and hesitant, about everything that's changed. About the boys, about me, about you. I don't know if I'm doing this right. Maya met his eyes, her gaze steady and understanding. Edward, you're doing the best you can, she said softly. And that's enough. You're not perfect, and that's okay. Nobody is. But the fact that you're here, that you're trying, that's what matters. Edward's heart tightened at her words. It wasn't the reassurance he was looking for, but it was the truth. Maya wasn't telling him that everything would be perfect, that he had somehow fixed everything. She was telling him that it was okay to be imperfect, to make mistakes, and still keep going. It was the kind of truth he hadn't been able to face for so long. I've been so focused on getting it right, Edward admitted, his voice raw, I didn't realize I was missing the point. It's not about getting it right every time, is it? Maya shook her head. No, it's not. It's about showing up. It's about being there for the people who need you, even when it's hard, even when it's messy. Edward looked at her, his mind racing with the weight of everything she had taught him. Maya had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. She had helped him open his eyes to what really mattered, to what it truly meant to be a father. And in the process, she had done something even more important, she had shown him how to be a better man. I didn't think I could do it, Edward confessed. I didn't think I could change. But now, I see that it's not about changing who I am, it's about learning to be better at the things that really matter. Maya smiled softly, the corners of her eyes crinkling with warmth. You're doing it, Edward, she said quietly. You've already changed. You just had to let yourself see it. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Edward had been so focused on what he hadn't done, on the mistakes he had made in the past, that he hadn't seen the progress he had made. He hadn't seen that he was already on the right path. The truth was, change wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that never really ended, but one that he could choose to walk every day. As Maya stood to leave, she paused at the door and turned to look at him. You're not alone in this, Edward, she said softly. We're in this together. Those simple words, filled with sincerity, were all Edward needed to hear. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. He wasn't perfect. He would never be. But he was doing his best. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. Weeks had passed since the night Edward and Maya had their conversation. The changes in the Hawthorne mansion were becoming more permanent, and it felt as though the family was finally beginning to heal from the scars of the past. The twins, Ethan and Eli, had become more than just better-behaved children. They had developed a bond with Maya that was more profound than Edward could have imagined. There was a new light in their eyes, a sense of trust and respect that had once been missing. Maya had been the catalyst for this transformation, and as time passed, Edward realized that his own relationship with his children was evolving as well. He wasn't just a father anymore, he was a partner in their lives, not someone who controlled, but someone who listened. And the difference was undeniable. One evening, after a particularly joyful dinner where they had all shared stories and laughter, Edward watched as his children, his sons, played in the yard with Maya. They were laughing, their joy echoing throughout the mansion. For a brief moment, Edward forgot all of his doubts. He forgot about the years of guilt and regret, the mistakes he had made, and the pressure he had placed on himself to fix everything. He simply watched as Maya interacted with his children, her presence soothing, yet strong. She was no longer just a maid to him. She had become family. He was beginning to understand just how much she had done for them. As the evening wore on, Maya joined Edward on the porch, both of them leaning against the railing, watching the sunset. There was a peaceful stillness between them, one that had become familiar over the past weeks. It was the kind of stillness that came from knowing, without words, that they were both in a good place. They've changed, Edward said, his voice quiet but full of gratitude. Maya smiled, her gaze still on the boys. They've always had it in them, she replied softly. They just needed someone to see them, to believe in them. Edward's heart swelled with emotion as he listened to her. I don't know how you do it, he said, his voice thick with admiration. How you reached them. How you reached me. Maya turned to him, her expression calm but kind. It's not about what I did, Edward. It's about what you did. You gave them the space to change, to be who they are. You let go of the control, and that made all the difference. Edward looked at her, his thoughts heavy with everything she had helped him realize. He had always thought he needed to have everything figured out, that he needed to control every aspect of his life and his children's lives. But Maya had shown him that true strength came from vulnerability, from allowing himself to be imperfect, from showing his children that it was okay to make mistakes and learn from them. For the first time, Edward felt like he was truly getting it. The path to change was not about fixing the past, it was about being present in the moment and accepting that things wouldn't always be perfect. I never imagined it could be this way, Edward said softly, his gaze drifting to the boys playing in the yard. I never thought I'd get to see them like this. Happy. Free. Maya smiled, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the moment. They've always had the potential to be happy, Edward. They just needed someone to help them find it. You've given them that. And they've given it back to you. Edward's heart felt lighter than it had in years. He had spent so much of his life chasing after success, building an empire, believing that those things would bring him fulfillment. But in the end, it was the simplest moments, the quiet, tender ones, that brought him the most joy. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to have all the answers. What mattered was that he was there for his children. What mattered was that he was showing up, every day, and being the father they needed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Edward felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he was able to let go of his doubts, his guilt, and his fear. He had finally found the kind of life he had always wanted, one filled with love, connection, and growth. And Maya, the quiet woman who had come into their lives as a maid, had been the key to it all. I don't know how to thank you, Edward said, his voice filled with gratitude. Maya shook her head gently, her smile soft but knowing. You don't need to thank me, Edward. You've already done it. By being here, by being the father they need, you've already given them everything they could ever ask for. The truth of her words settled in Edward's heart. He didn't need to keep striving for something he could never reach. The only thing he needed to do was be present and trust in the love that surrounded him. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Edward took a deep breath, his heart full. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it side by side with Maya, with his sons, and with the family they had become. The next few weeks were filled with a new sense of normalcy in the Hawthorne mansion. Maya had become more than just a caretaker, she was a cornerstone in the lives of the family, and Edward found himself relying on her wisdom and calm presence more than ever. The twins, Ethan and Eli, continued to flourish under her care. They were still their playful selves, but there was a newfound respect in their actions and a sense of responsibility that had never been there before. The house, once filled with tension and chaos, had become a place of laughter and connection. For Edward, the transformation was more than he had ever hoped for, but it also stirred up deeper feelings of guilt. He found himself questioning how he had allowed things to get this far. He had spent so many years focused on work and material success, only to realize that the most important things in life, his children's happiness, their well-being, and the connections they shared, had been right in front of him all along. Maya had been the key to this realization, and yet, the nagging feeling of regret remained. One evening, after a peaceful dinner with the family, Edward sat alone in his study, staring out the window at the city lights in the distance. He felt a wave of doubt wash over him. Was this real? Was the change in his children truly lasting, or was it just a phase? The fear that things might slip back into the way they had been before was overwhelming. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Maya entered the room quietly, her presence as calm and steady as ever. Can we talk? She asked, her voice gentle but firm. Edward stood up, motioning for her to come in. He had been hoping for a chance to speak with her, to ask her about his fears, but he wasn't sure how to start. He sat down on the chair, and Maya sat across from him, her eyes thoughtful and understanding. There was no need for words at first. They both knew why this conversation was happening. Finally, Edward broke the silence. I've been thinking about everything that's changed. About the boys, about me. I know I've made progress, but I'm scared. What if this is all temporary? What if I can't keep it up? What if the boys go back to the way they were? Maya looked at him with a quiet compassion. Edward, she said softly, I understand your fears. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But you've already done so much. The boys have changed because they feel seen, they feel heard, and they feel loved. That's something that can't easily be taken away. Edward's chest tightened as he listened to her words. But I've been so focused on trying to fix everything, to make everything perfect, he admitted, his voice heavy. I don't know if I can keep being the father they need. I don't know if I'm enough. Maya smiled gently, her eyes full of understanding. You don't have to be perfect, Edward. Nobody is. What matters is that you're trying. What matters is that you're present. You've given them a gift, your time, your love, and your attention. And that's more than enough. Edward felt a lump in his throat. He had been so caught up in his own expectations of himself, in the fear of failure, that he hadn't seen the progress he had already made. The simple act of showing up, of being there for his children, had made all the difference. Maya continued, her voice steady and reassuring. The boys aren't looking for perfection. They're looking for consistency, for someone who will always be there, no matter what. And you've shown them that. Edward swallowed hard, his mind beginning to shift. He realized that it wasn't about perfection. It was about effort. It was about being there, even when it was hard, even when it felt like he wasn't doing enough. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. Thank you for helping me see that. Maya's smile softened. You've always had it in you, Edward. I just helped you see it. The room was silent for a moment, but this time, it wasn't a silence filled with doubt. Or fear. It was a silence filled with understanding. Edward knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't alone in this journey. Maya was there, and the love he had for his children was enough to guide him through. As he looked at her, a deep sense of gratitude filled his heart. I couldn't have done this without you, he said softly. Maya nodded. You did it, Edward. You just needed someone to remind you of your own strength. Edward smiled, the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he was on the right path. And as he walked this path with his children, with Maya by his side, he felt more certain than ever that they would make it through together. The next day brought a subtle shift in the house. The warmth of understanding that had been growing between Edward and Maya had now extended to the boys. Ethan and Eli were still playful, but there was a new maturity in their eyes, something deeper than the usual mischief. It was the first time Edward truly believed that they might have turned a corner. He sat in his study, watching them play in the yard through the window. The noise of their laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence that had once consumed the mansion. It was an easy joy, unburdened by the tension that had so often ruled their lives. For the first time, Edward allowed himself to believe in the possibility of lasting change. As the evening approached, Maya entered his study with a gentle knock. She had been in the kitchen, preparing dinner, but there was something different about the way she moved. There was no hurried step, no anxious glance. She was at peace, and it was contagious. Edward looked up from his desk as she entered, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. How are they? He asked, his voice soft. Maya paused for a moment, then replied, They're good. They're just being kids. But I see a difference. They're learning to be more patient with each other. And with themselves. Edward leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had been so focused on the boys' behavior, on trying to make them fit into some idea of what he thought they should be, that he hadn't stopped to appreciate the progress they had made in such a short time. I never thought I'd see them like this, he said quietly. I didn't think they could change. But Maya, you show me that they can. Maya's eyes softened as she took a seat across from him. They had the potential all along, Edward. It was never about changing who they were. It was about giving them a safe space to be who they are. To make mistakes and grow from them. Edward nodded slowly, absorbing her words. I spent so many years trying to control everything. I thought if I could just push hard enough, if I could just control their environment, they would turn out the way I wanted them to. But I was wrong. It wasn't about control at all. Maya smiled, her expression one of quiet wisdom. It's about trust, she said gently. It's about believing in them even when they don't believe in themselves. It's about giving them the tools to figure things out on their own, while being there to guide them when they need it. Edward sat in silence for a moment, his mind turning over the lessons he had learned in the past weeks. He had been so caught up in his own fears, in the idea of failure, that he hadn't seen what Maya had already shown him, that his children were capable of so much more than he had given them credit for. He had been focused on fixing what was broken, but in doing so, he had overlooked what was right in front of him. His sons were good, kind, and strong. They just needed someone to help them see that. I've been hard on myself, Edward admitted, his voice quiet. I feel like I wasted so much time, like I should have done more, been more. Maya shook her head softly. You did what you could with what you knew at the time. And now, you're doing better. That's all that matters. Edward looked up at her, feeling a shift within himself. He no longer felt the weight of his past mistakes crushing him. Instead, he felt a sense of freedom, a realization that it wasn't too late to be the father his children needed. It wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, being present, and believing in his children, even when they couldn't see their own worth. I don't know what the future holds, he said, his voice stronger now. But I know that I want to be there for them. I want to be the father they deserve. And I want to keep learning, keep growing with them. Maya's smile deepened, and she nodded. You're already on the right path, Edward. The future is full of possibilities, but it's your willingness to change, to grow with them, that will make all the difference. Edward felt the final piece of the puzzle fall into place. He had spent so long fearing that he had missed his chance to be the father he wanted to be. But now, he understood. It wasn't about looking back at what he had done wrong. It was about moving forward, about making the most of the moments he had now. The change he had been waiting for wasn't a one-time event, it was a process, a continuous journey of learning and growing together. And with Maya by his side, and with his sons growing into the young men they were meant to be, Edward knew that they were ready to face whatever came next. With a deep breath, he stood up from his desk and walked over to the window. He looked out at the yard, where Ethan and Eli were still laughing, carefree. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed that everything was going to be okay. A month had passed since that night when Edward first allowed himself to believe in the possibility of lasting change. The peace in the Hawthorne mansion had become a constant presence, a comforting hum in the background of their lives. Ethan and Eli were thriving, growing into young men who no longer lived under the weight of their past struggles. They were still children, of course, full of energy and life, but they had learned something important, the value of respect, patience, and kindness. And that was something that Maya had shown them. Maya, who had come into their lives as just a maid, had become something far more profound. She had become a mother figure, a teacher, and in many ways, the glue that held the family together. Edward could see the change in his sons, but more than that, he could see the change in himself. He was no longer the man who hid behind wealth and power. He had begun to embrace his vulnerability, his flaws, and most importantly, he had started to trust himself as a father. There was still doubt, of course, lingering in the back of his mind, but each day that passed, he grew more confident that they were on the right path. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Edward found himself on the porch, watching his sons play with Maya in the yard. The laughter that filled the air was a sound he had almost forgotten, the kind of laughter that came from a place of pure joy. Maya was sitting on the grass, a smile on her face as Ethan and Eli tried to teach her how to kick a soccer ball. She laughed along with them, the sound so light and genuine that it made Edward's heart swell. As he watched them, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Maya, for her patience, her strength, and for everything she had done for his children. And yet, as he stood there, he still had that lingering fear that somehow, this piece would slip away. The past had been filled with so many mistakes, and though things had gotten better, Edward couldn't help but wonder if he was truly worthy of this newfound happiness. He had been so disconnected for so long, and even though the transformation in his children was undeniable, he still struggled to believe it was real. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Maya walking toward him, her calm presence filling the space around him. She stopped beside him, and they both stood there in silence for a moment, watching the boys in the yard. "You know," Maya said, her voice gentle, "I never thought I'd see them like this. They've really come a long way." Edward nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd see them like this either. I didn't think they could change. But Maya, you've made it happen." Maya smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. "They always had it in them, Edward. They just needed to know that they could. That they didn't have to be trapped by their past." Edward took a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so many years trying to fix things, trying to control everything. But what Maya had shown him was that real change didn't come from force. It came from love, from understanding, and from creating a safe space where growth could happen. "I've been so focused on being perfect," Edward said quietly, "so afraid of making mistakes. I didn't think I could be the father they needed." Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You don't have to be perfect, Edward. You just have to be present. You've been there for them, and that's all that matters." Edward looked at her, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. He had been afraid that his past mistakes would define him, that he wasn't capable of being the father his children needed. But in that moment, he realized that it wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up, every day, and doing his best. "Thank you," Edward whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for showing me what really matters." Maya smiled, her eyes warm. "You've always known, Edward. You just needed to believe in yourself." They stood there together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sounds of laughter filling the air. In that moment, Edward knew that everything was going to be okay. The past was behind him, and the future, though uncertain, held endless possibilities. The family he had once feared was beyond repair was now whole again, stronger than ever. And as he watched his sons, he realized that they had all changed, not because of any grand gesture, but because of the simple, everyday love they had shown each other. They had given each other the greatest gift of all, the chance to grow, to learn, and to become who they were always meant to be. The days continued to pass in the Hawthorne mansion, and with each passing day, the changes that had begun in their family became more permanent. The bonds between Edward, Maya, and the twins grew stronger, and the once tense atmosphere in the house had been replaced with warmth and understanding. Ethan and Eli, the mischievous twins who had once been the source of constant stress and conflict, had grown into more considerate, responsible young men. They still had their playful energy, but there was a new maturity in their eyes. They had learned to listen, to respect the people around them, and to see the value in kindness and compassion. Edward looked at them with pride. He had watched them struggle for so long, and now, seeing them grow and thrive, it felt like a dream come true. He knew they weren't perfect, and they never would be, but they were on the right path. The transformation had been gradual, but it had been real. It was a transformation that Maya had helped catalyze, but it was also a reflection of the changes Edward had made within himself. He had spent so much of his life focused on material success and control, believing that wealth and power would solve his problems. But now, he understood that the most important things in life weren't things at all. It was the relationships he had with his family, the love he gave and received, and the ability to be present, to listen, to learn from his mistakes. One evening, after dinner, the family gathered together in the living room. Ethan and Eli were sitting on the floor, laughing and playing a game with Maya. Edward sat on the couch, watching them with a sense of peace he had never known before. Maya, who had once been just a maid in their home, was now an integral part of their family. She had taught them all so much, not just about parenting or discipline, but about life. She had taught Edward how to be a better father, how to be more present for his children, and how to show love without expecting anything in return. Edward had come to rely on her wisdom, her calm presence, and her unwavering belief in the potential of his children. He had learned that it wasn't about being perfect, but about showing up, day after day, and doing his best. And he had learned that mistakes were not failures, but opportunities to learn and grow. As Edward watched Maya interact with his children, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had been so lost in his own fears and insecurities for so long, but now he was starting to see the world through a different lens. He was no longer the man who hid behind wealth and status, afraid of his own imperfections. He was a father, someone who could make mistakes, admit when he was wrong, and still be loved by his children. It was a humbling realization. Maya, too, had changed. When she had first come into their lives, she had been focused on doing her job, keeping the house in order. But over time, she had become something more, a teacher, a guide, a mother figure to the twins. She had given them something that no amount of money or power could provide, unconditional love. And in return, she had received a family that loved her in ways she had never imagined. Maya had never expected this. She had come to the Hawthorne mansion to work, to do her job. But as time went on, she had found herself becoming emotionally invested in the family's well-being. She had grown close to the twins, and even closer to Edward. She had seen the potential in all of them, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. And now, watching them all together, she felt a quiet pride in what they had achieved. "You know," Edward said softly, breaking the silence, "I never thought we'd get here." Maya looked at him, her eyes warm. "What do you mean?" she asked. Edward smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I mean, I never thought things could change. I never thought we could be a family again. But here we are. And I have you to thank for that." Maya's smile deepened, and she shook her head gently. "You did it, Edward," she said. "You made the change. You opened up. You trusted your children and you trusted yourself. That's all I ever wanted for you." Edward's heart swelled with emotion. He had spent so many years locked in his own fears, trying to control everything, and now he realized that the key to everything he wanted, everything he needed, was to let go. To trust. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Edward admitted, his voice thick with gratitude. Maya simply smiled, her gaze steady. "You would have figured it out, Edward. But I'm glad I was here to help you see it." The room was quiet for a moment, the only sound being the laughter of the twins as they continued to play. Edward sat back in his chair, his mind at peace. He didn't have all the answers, and he never would. But for the first time in his life, he knew that he didn't need them. What mattered now was that he was here, with his children, with Maya, and together, they were moving forward, side by side. Edward watched as his sons ran around the room, their laughter echoing in his ears. He smiled, knowing that no matter what challenges they would face in the future, they would face them together. And that was enough. In this heartwarming and transformative journey, a wealthy father and his rebellious twin sons find healing and change with the help of Maya, a compassionate black maid. Through her understanding and love, the family bonds grow stronger, and the boys learn the value of respect and empathy. As Maya helps guide them on a path of growth, the father begins to reflect on his past mistakes and learns that true success in life comes not from control, but from love and patience. The powerful lessons in this story echo many themes from Black stories about family, healing, and redemption. Maya's influence is life-changing, proving that the best lessons often come from the most unexpected sources. As the family grows together, they learn that it's never too late to change, and that real growth comes from showing up and being present for those you love. This moving tale of transformation and understanding shows the depth of Black stories and how they often speak to universal truths of connection, healing, and love. For Edward and his sons, the journey is just beginning, and with Maya by their side, they face the future with hope, love, and a newfound sense of family. Maya's role in their lives proves how the power of love and belief in others can overcome even the deepest struggles. The impact of Black stories is clear here, as we witness not just a change in behavior but a deep emotional transformation that impacts the entire family.